The fog came in off the North Atlantic every evening like something alive, rolling across the moors in great gray curtains that swallowed the standing stones whole and turned the low stone fences into suggestions. Mira Ellison had grown up in this fog. She knew how to read it, how to move through it without losing herself. She knew which rises hid the old sheep trails, and which depressions held standing water that could swallow a boot up to the ankle. What she did not know on the evening of the 14th of November was what the light in the eastern moor was. It wasn't lightning. She'd stood at her cottage window for a long time watching it, telling herself it was lightning. It strobed wrong for lightning, too regular, too low, too intensely amber at its center where lightning was always white. It didn't crack. It didn't roll in the way thunder does, arriving to fill the chest seconds after the flash. It pulsed. Steady as a heartbeat, steady as a lighthouse, and then it stopped and there was only the fog. She stood at that window a long time after it went dark. Mira was 38 years old, a geophysicist attached to the University of Edinburgh's remote monitoring station, 2 kilometers from the nearest village of Craigforth. She had the long-boned look of someone who had spent a great deal of her life leaning over instrument consoles in small rooms. Slightly stooped, slightly squinting. Her hair was dark where it wasn't gray. She had her father's precision about her, the late Professor Ellison, who had spent his last years charting the path of a rogue planetary body through the outer solar system before his heart gave out over his own console. 3 winters passed. She had inherited his equipment. She had inherited his notes. She had inherited his question. She had not inherited an answer, not until the light on the moor. She put on her field coat and her wellies, and she went out into the dark. The station's secondary seismograph had registered the touchdown 4 hours before Mira found the ship. It had logged the event as a minor subsurface tremor, 1.4 on the Richter, consistent with coastal settling, and filed it neatly into the automated archive, where it would have remained unexamined for weeks. Mira pulled the log on her tablet as she walked, watching the waveform. It wasn't settling. She knew what settling looked like. Settling was a gradual thing, a sigh in the earth. This was an impact. Brief, controlled, precise. Something heavy had set itself down on the moor with extraordinary deliberateness. She found it at the edge of the eastern bog, where the heather grew black and thick, and the ground was uncertain underfoot. It was perhaps 8 meters across, spherical or close to it, with a slight oblate flattening at the base. The surface was the color of old pewter, dull in most places, but with a burnished strip around the equator that caught the faint moonlight and held it. It rested in a shallow depression it had made in the peat. There were no seams she could see, no obvious entry points, no markings in any recognizable system, no heat shimmer. Whatever propulsion had carried it here had cooled quickly or had never burned in any conventional sense. Mira stood 20 meters away and breathed fog for a while. Then she took out her tablet and began making notes. She did not call the authorities that night. This was not panic or recklessness or any of the things a person reviewing her record afterward might assume. It was professional discipline, the same discipline her father had taught her. The same discipline that had made her good at what she did. You did not report an anomaly until you had characterized it. You did not describe a thing until you had observed it. You did not tell anyone what you thought you saw until you were sure you understood what you were seeing, because between the first observation and the understanding was a gap where bad information lived, and bad information was worse than silence. She went back each of the next 3 nights. She measured. She documented. She mapped the electromagnetic profile of the object with a handheld Gauss meter and found that it broadcast on frequencies she had not previously associated with any manufactured or natural terrestrial source. The broadcast was not random. It repeated. It had structure. On the 4th night, she was crouched at the edge of her documentation perimeter when a panel in the sphere's surface irised open. There was no other word for it. It opened the way an eye opens, smoothly and from a central point outward, and something emerged. Mir did not run. She wanted to. The instinct was there, immediate and electric, a cold flood from the base of the spine to the back of the throat. Every ancient, pre-rational circuit in her nervous system screamed at her to put distance between herself and the thing crawling out of the sphere on the dark moor. And she stayed. She stayed because her father had told her once that the moment you run from a thing you don't understand, you have permanently changed your relationship to understanding. You have decided that fear gets a vote. Once fear gets a vote, it always gets a vote. She stayed and she watched. It was small, smaller than she'd imagined, if she'd let herself imagine. Perhaps 1.5 meters tall, slight in the way of something that had never needed to carry its own weight against significant gravity. Its skin, if it was skin, was pale to the point of translucence in the tablet's field light, faintly luminescent at the joints, and along what she took to be a jawline. Its face was recognizable as a face. Two sensory organs that might be eyes, a nasal structure, something like a mouth. But the proportions were wrong in ways she couldn't immediately catalog, as though a sculptor had worked from a description of a human face, rather than an observation of one, and had gotten the architecture right while missing something essential about the weight of it. The specific gravity of a face that had spent decades holding expressions. It looked at her. She looked at it. She raised her hand slowly and said, "Hello." The alien did not respond in any way she recognized as communication, but it did not retreat. It stood in the open hatch of its sphere and looked at her across 20 meters of Scottish peat bog. And something in its stillness felt to Mira, less like the blankness of an organism that couldn't perceive her, and more like the quality of attention she associated with very intelligent creatures, encountering something they were trying hard to classify. She came back the next night with a speaker and a laptop. She played tones, she played mathematical sequences, she played recordings of human speech in a dozen languages. The alien stood or sat in its hatch, and occasionally it would make a sound, not quite a sound, more a vibration in the air that she felt in her molars before she heard it with her ears, in response to specific sequences. She cataloged which ones. She built a rough map of the intersections. By the end of the second week, she had something that might charitably be called the scaffold of a vocabulary. 23 concepts imprecisely matched, shakily grounded: danger, distance, number, time. The word or the concept that seemed to correspond to home and to hurt, used apparently interchangeably, which she found either profound or a coincidence of translation. She had not told anyone. This was the decision that would cost her. Dr. Ren Callis arrived at the monitoring station on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the ship touched down, bearing university credentials and an unscheduled evaluation order for the remote station's equipment. He was 45, well-dressed for the setting, with the particular brand of easy confidence that Mira had learned over the years to treat as a warning sign, the confidence of a man who believed the world organized itself around his needs, because so far, it largely had. He said the right things. He was complimentary about the station, about her father's legacy, about the quality of the seismic data she'd been producing. He had a flask of decent whiskey that he offered without making a production of it, which she appreciated. She did not tell him about the ship. She didn't tell him because there was something in the way he looked at the station's equipment. A particular evaluative quality. The way a man looks at hardware he's already decided he wants. That made her careful. She was not paranoid. She simply noticed. He noticed things too. He found the secondary seismograph log on his second day, the one she hadn't thought to file away. He found the anomalous EM readings she'd exported to the station archive for backup. He found her field notes. Not all of them. She'd kept the key documentation on a personal encrypted drive. But enough. Enough to know she had been visiting something in the Eastern Moor repeatedly, and at night. He came to her with the flask again that evening, and set it on her desk between them and said, "Tell me what you found." And she made a calculation. A bad one, as it turned out, though she had her reasons. She was alone, and the thing she had found was beyond her current ability to protect or formalize on her own. She needed eventually to bring someone into it. She needed institutional weight. She needed resources. Callis had all of those things. He was difficult to read and she didn't fully trust him. But she was in a fog of her own, and she made a mistake that a person can understand and still not forgive herself for. She told him. She took him to the ship the following night. He stood where she had stood, at the edge of the documentation perimeter, and when the alien appeared in the hatch, Mira watched Callis's face instead of the alien. She saw it happen. She saw the thing that separated them, the fundamental divergence between two people looking at the same object. She looked at the alien and felt the presence of a vast unknown, something terrifying and extraordinary and precious. Callis looked at the alien and did a quick, efficient inventory of what it might be worth. He was careful for the first week. He came with her to the nightly sessions. He watched her vocabulary work with what she took for curiosity. He asked good questions. He was, she acknowledged, genuinely intelligent, and he understood her methodology more quickly than she'd expected. It was when he began insisting on time alone with the alien that she started to understand her mistake. She refused him, flatly, twice, with reasons she kept professional and calm. The alien was acclimatizing to her specifically. introducing an unknown variable, a new person, new behavioral patterns, new emotional gesture. At this stage of a fragile communicative framework was bad science and potentially dangerous. She was not prepared to jeopardize 3 weeks of careful work for his curiosity. He said he understood. He was gracious about it. He poured 2 fingers of whiskey for each of them, and raised his glass and smiled. 3 nights later she came back from a resupply run into the village to find the alien's ship sealed shut, and a fresh boot track, not hers, in the peat mud outside the hatch. She stood very still with the fog moving around her and did the arithmetic. Inside the sealed ship, something changed in the broadcast frequencies. She felt it on the Gauss meter before she heard anything. A sharp spike and then a new signal, lower and more complex, with a quality to it that her rough vocabulary map hadn't prepared her for, but that her nervous system apparently understood anyway. It felt like something locking. It felt like a door closing. She ran, not away, toward the station. The attacks began in Craigforth 2 days later. They didn't announce themselves. That was the first thing that was wrong with every model Mira had. In all the scenarios she'd run in her head over the previous weeks, the first indicators of a threat response from an advanced alien species were supposed to be grand and legible. An obvious message, a dramatic demonstration. Something that left no interpretive ambiguity. What happened instead was subtle, and therefore, for the first 36 hours, nearly invisible. People in Craigforth stopped making decisions. She noticed it first with Hamish, the owner of the village's only functioning pub, who had been running that pub for 22 years, and who had opinions about everything from the proper temperature of a proper pint to the geopolitical dimensions of North Sea fishing rights. She went in for a meal on the first evening after the ship sealed itself, and Hamish brought her food without being asked, got her order exactly right, refilled her water glass twice, and said nothing. No complaint about the weather, no inquiry about her research, no opinion on anything. He moved behind the bar with the efficient blankness of a machine running a program. She watched 3 other patrons, same quality of stillness. Eyes open, functional, responsive to stimuli, empty. She went to the constable's office. The constable, a woman named Drummond, who had once spent 45 minutes explaining to Mira the ethical dimensions of a minor property dispute involving 2 neighboring farmers, looked up from her desk and waited. "Is there anything strange going on in town?" Mira asked. "Strange," Drummond said. And it wasn't really a question, more a word held up to see if it still had meaning. Mira left and walked very quickly back up the road toward the monitoring station and the moor, doing a kind of internal inventory that she recognized as the first stage of controlled panic. Cataloging what she knew, sorting it into reliable and unreliable, locating the narrow lane between what the evidence supported and what her fear was suggesting. What she knew, the alien had come from a dying world. She knew this from the vocabulary work, from the concept it used interchangeably for home and hurt, from the quality of urgency in its early signals, before callous. It had come looking for something. She had assumed it was looking for communication, for contact, for whatever an intelligent species from a dying world might cross interstellar distances seeking. She understood now that she had been, in the most critical way possible, too optimistic. What she knew, Callus had done something in those hours alone with the alien, had taken something, had threatened something, had demonstrated in some irreducibly human way that humanity's default relationship with the unknown was extraction. He had done what frightened, greedy things do when they encounter something they can't control. What she knew, the alien was not human. Its psychology, its threat assessment framework, its decision tree about what to do when a member of a species turned hostile, all of that was alien. It couldn't be expected to parse the difference between Callus and Mira, between the man with his hands on what didn't belong to him, and the woman who had spent 3 weeks in a cold bog trying to learn how to say hello. This was the thing that made her sit down on the road in the fog, halfway between the village and the station, for 90 seconds, the unfairness of it. The specific human unfairness of being held accountable for what someone else had done, of having built something carefully and watched it destroyed carelessly, of being one person trying to do a hard thing right, and being judged by the worst of what your species was capable of. 90 seconds. Then she stood up, because the alternative to standing up was to stay on the road in the fog, and whatever was happening in Craigforth was going to keep happening, and she was the only person in the area who had any idea what was going on. She needed to think like the alien. She needed to think like something that had come a vast distance from a dying world, and had reached out a hand, in the most careful and tentative way it knew how, and had that hand slapped down by the first person who'd pushed past the one trying to bridge the gap. She needed to think about what an intelligent, wounded, frightened creature does when it decides that communication has failed and that the only remaining option is control. Minimum necessary control. That was the phrase she kept coming back to as she walked. A species capable of interstellar travel was capable of much more destructive action than turning the inhabitants of a village into passive automatons. It wasn't destroying Craigforth. It wasn't even hurting Craigforth. It was incapacitating it. Buying time, creating a buffer, which meant it was afraid. Which meant it was not so different from her, sitting on the road in the fog. She found Callus at the monitoring station. He was at her console, working through her encrypted files with what she had to acknowledge was impressive technical skill. He'd gotten past 2 of her 3 security layers. He looked up when she came in and had the grace to look uncomfortable, though not the grace to look ashamed. "You need to stop," she said. "There's technology in that ship that could. I know what you think is in that ship. You need to stop, Mira." He set his hands flat on the desk in a gesture of reasonableness. "Think about what we're talking about here. An alien spacecraft. Materials science we don't have. Propulsion we don't have. Whatever they used to do what they did to the village." "To the village," she said. "You noticed." "Of course I noticed. That's exactly my point. We need to understand that capability. We need to contain it." "Those are people in that village," Mira said, "not a capability. People." He looked at her the way a certain kind of person looks at you when you've said something they consider sentimental. Patient, a little tired. She was very calm. Calmer than she'd been on the road. Calmer than she'd been in the bog when the ship sealed. The calm that comes, she'd found, when there was simply too much at stake for the luxury of feeling it fully. "I'm going back to the ship," she said. "I'm going to try to fix what you broke. I would very much appreciate it if you stayed here." He stood up. "I'll come with you. You won't. You can't stop me from." "I know I can't stop you," she said. "I'm asking you not to. There's a difference." The alien understands that difference, by the way. That was one of the first 23 concepts I mapped. The difference between a thing that can be prevented and a thing that is chosen. I don't think it's an accident that was one of the first things it needed a word for. She left him standing at the console. The walk to the moor in the dark and fog was long enough to go over it all again, to poke at her reasoning, to look for the places it failed. She'd done this her whole career. Walking, thinking, finding the errors in the daylight conclusions that only became visible at night. Her father had done the same. He'd told her once that the moor was good for it because the fog made everything else invisible. Stripped the field down to just you and the problem, no distractions, no comfortable escapes. He'd also told her that the most important thing a scientist could do, when she'd gotten something badly wrong, was to go back and get it right. Not to catalog the wrongness and study it and write a paper about it. To go back and fix it. The literature on error was less important than the act of correction. She had the tablet with the vocabulary map. She had the speaker. She had, for reasons she was not entirely able to articulate rationally, her father's old compass. Not because she needed it for navigation, but because carrying it felt like carrying something solid in a situation where solidity was rare. The ship was open when she got there. Not fully open. The iris hatch was cracked 3 or 4 centimeters, letting out a faint amber light. The alien was not visible. But the EM broadcast had changed again. She could feel it in the Gauss meter the moment she stepped into the bog, and the character of the change was not the locked, hardened signal from 2 days ago. It was something closer to the early frequencies, from the first nights. Watchful, not decided. She set up the speaker at the perimeter, and sat down cross-legged in the wet heather, and pulled out the tablet. She started with the 23 concepts. Not performing them, not using them as a preamble to what she actually wanted to say, just saying them, laying them out. Home and hurt, distance, time, number, danger, the word for choose. The word she'd mapped, tentatively and carefully as listen. The amber light through the cracked hatch changed in quality, but not intensity. She said, in the rough phonemic approximations she'd developed over the previous weeks, what she believed to be, "I am not the other one." She had no idea if that was what actually came out. The vocabulary map was 23 concepts built over 14 days of trial and error, and the phonemic approximations were her best guesses at a sound system. She didn't have the physiology to reproduce perfectly. She might have said something entirely different. She might have said nothing meaningful at all. The hatch opened another 10 centimeters. She kept going, she said, He is not here, she said. I came by choosing. She said the word for listen 4 times slowly. She said the number 1 and pointed to herself and said the word she'd mapped as alone. The alien appeared in the hatch. It was different than it had been. She noticed it immediately. Not in any single dramatic way, but in the aggregate. The way you notice that someone you know is unwell not from any one symptom but from the sum of small wrong things. Its luminescence at the joints was duller. It moved slowly in a way that wasn't the deliberate slowness of care, but the impeded slowness of something hurting. Callus had done that. Whatever Callus had done in the hours he'd been alone at this hatch, it had cost the alien something physical. She didn't move toward it. She stayed at the perimeter, cross-legged in the heather, and put her hands where it could see them. She said, I see hurt. It made the subvocalic vibration that she'd come to associate with acknowledgement. Not agreement, not confirmation exactly, more the alien equivalent of a person nodding slightly because they need a moment to process and the nod fills the space. She said, he wanted, take. Another vibration, lower this time with a quality she hadn't heard before. Not from the vocabulary map. Something beyond the map. She sat with it, not rushing to classify it, letting it exist in the space between them as an unresolved thing that she would try to understand rather than assume. She said, I want words. Only words. She put the tablet down in the heather in front of her, facing up, the vocabulary map visible on the screen. She put the speaker beside it. She spread her hands and was still. The alien descended from the hatch. It moved across the bog toward her with a gait that was wrong in its joint articulation, but not unsteady, and it stopped at the perimeter. Her perimeter, the 20-meter mark she'd been respecting for 3 weeks, and looked at the tablet. It made a sound she recognized from the very first night. The first night she'd played mathematical sequences when it had responded to the prime numbers series. A rising tonal sequence, brief, that she'd eventually mapped as something like, correct, or, yes, this one. Then it looked at her. She nodded. She picked up the tablet and held it between them, halfway across the perimeter. What followed was 4 hours of the most exhausting and clarifying work she had ever done. The alien moved at some point to within a few meters of her, and it had its own methods of communications that she hadn't fully appreciated from a distance. Not just phonemic sound but shifts in bioluminescence, in the pattern of its joint glow, that carried emotional valence she could read imprecisely but read. It was trying, as hard as she was trying, across the same gap she was trying to cross, and the parallel effort of that. The recognition that the effort was mutual was the thing that broke something open between them. They built 14 new concepts that night, 14 new points of shared understanding, among them, the word or the concept for mistake. The alien's concept of mistake was interesting. It was grammatically transitive in a way that English wasn't quite equipped to match. A mistake was always a mistake done to something, never just an event, always an action with a recipient. The opposite of the choose concept, in a way. Choose was pure agency, and mistake was agency with consequence, with a kind of weight built into the word itself that acknowledged the recipient. Among them, the concept Mira eventually mapped as intention before act, or more precisely the quality of an action that has been thought through in advance versus the quality of an action that has not. This distinction in the alien's conceptual system was apparently as fundamental as the distinction between animate and inanimate, and carried enormous moral weight. Callus, in this framework, had committed a mistake that was also an intention before act, premeditated harm. Mira, in the alien's assessment, had committed a mistake of a different kind. She had brought Callus, she had enabled the access. But it was a mistake without the premeditation weight. She had not known, she hadn't needed to explain this. The alien had made the distinction itself, and the form of the distinction was a small thing she would think about for years afterward. The difference between the grammatical weight it put on Callus's actions and the weight it put on hers was the difference between how you might talk about a stone that fell and hurt you, and how you might talk about a person who threw it. Among them, what Mira would later tentatively and inadequately translate as, I came here because we have run out of time. She put that one together slowly, across an hour of careful back and forth, checking it from multiple angles, testing it against adjacent concepts until she was as sure as she could be. The alien's world was dying, not slowly, or rather it was dying on a cosmological timescale that felt slow from outside but in lived experience was immediate, brutal, without appeal. The rogue planetary body her father had spent his last years tracking from this moor was not passing through the solar system. It was the alien's home. and it was on a trajectory that would eventually carry it too far from any star to sustain what remained of the civilization on it. The alien had not come to invade. It had come to ask. For what exactly was still beyond the vocabulary they had? Resources, perhaps. Knowledge. Coordinates. Something that the dying world needed that Earth might have or might be able to provide. Something that a communication, if communication had been possible, if Callus had not been there, if Mira's careful scaffold had been allowed to develop, might have led toward. Callus had reached through that opening and grabbed, and the alien had recoiled. As anything intelligent and hurting will recoil, when the hand it reached out is treated as an object to be seized. She spent the last hour of their session working on one thing, one specific exchange, one concept she needed to convey with enough precision that it would carry weight. We are not all the other one. This was the concept that English handled poorly. We, the species, contained multitudes, contained Callus and contained Mira, and contained everything between them and beyond them in both directions. The alien's language appeared to have more nuance here, or at least more grammatical machinery for distinguishing between the behavior of an individual and the character of a group. She worked at the edges of that machinery carefully, the way you work at a knot, not forcing it, finding the give. What she got across eventually, approximately, impressively, but she believed it was there was something like, one acted wrong. Some will always act wrong, some will not. The alien sat with that for a long time, in the heather, in the dark, in the fog, with its joint glow pulsing in the slow pattern she'd come to associate with something being processed rather than something being dismissed. Then it made a sound she hadn't heard before. Not from the vocabulary map, not from any of the 14 new concepts. Something different. Something that didn't require translation, not because it was human, but because certain things. She believed this. She had believed it for as long as she could remember. She believed it more firmly than almost anything else she knew. Certain things exist below the level of language, below the specific vocabularies of specific species, in the place where things that think recognize each other. It wasn't forgiveness. She didn't want to call it that, because forgiveness was too simple and too human, and the alien had its own architecture for that concept which she didn't yet understand. It was something older, something that two different kinds of mind can arrive at from completely different directions. Across a vocabulary of 23 plus 14 concepts, built over 3 exhausting weeks, when both of them are trying. She called it acknowledgement. That there were two of them, here in the dark, that both of them understood something about what it meant to reach and be hurt and reach again. She called it a beginning. She found Callus at the edge of the moor when she came back. He'd followed her after all, of course he had, and he'd watched from a distance. And she could see from his face that he'd seen enough to understand that whatever he'd broken, he hadn't broken past repair. There was something in his expression she chose not to spend time analyzing, some mixture of resentment and relief that was his problem to work out. You talked to it, he said. I talked to them, she said. Different word. Matters. He opened his mouth and she held up her hand. I need you to go back to Edinburgh, she said. Tonight, if you can manage it. I need you to flag this through the university, and I need you to do it without telling them what you did at the ship. And I know that's not fair to ask, and I'm asking it anyway. Because what we need right now is help and not a scandal. I need linguists. I need xenobiologists. I need people who know how to think about dying civilizations and what they might need. I need people who know how to listen. He looked at her for a long moment. And what are you going to do, he said. I'm going to go back, she said, and keep talking. She didn't wait for his answer. She turned around and walked back toward the ship. Across the wet heather, in the fog, in the dark, carrying her father's compass and her tablet, and the 37 concepts that were the beginning of something she couldn't name yet, and didn't need to, because naming was what you did when you were ready to stop adding to something, and she was nowhere near done. The alien was still there when she came back. Sitting outside the hatch in the heather, in the dark, patient, the way something very old is patient when it has run out of the luxury of hurry. She sat down at the perimeter and pulled out the tablet, she said, in the imperfect approximation of a language she was just beginning to understand. I came back. The joint glow brightened slightly. She opened a new page in the vocabulary map and wrote the number 38 at the top. There were 112 people in Craigforth that night who did not know any of this was happening. By morning they were waking up with the mild, confused quality of people who have slept too deeply, who have gaps they can't account for, who make their tea and look out their windows at the fog, and feel that something has shifted in the world without knowing what. The signal that had held them had withdrawn sometime in the hours before dawn, quietly and completely, like the fog itself. A presence that thins and thins until you realize it's been gone for a while, and you only just noticed. Hamish opened his pub at the normal hour and had opinions about the weather. Constable Drummond wrote a report about a light on the moor that several residents had reported and set it aside under miscellaneous atmospheric phenomena, because some things require the right framework before they can be understood. And the framework was still being built by a woman in a field coat, sitting cross-legged in the heather, talking to the dark. The first team from Edinburgh arrived 6 days later. They were good people, careful, cautious, humble about what they didn't know in the ways that matter. Mira briefed them for 8 hours before she took them to the moor. She spent most of those 8 hours not on science but on how to sit, how to be still, how to put your hands where they could be seen, how to bring your vocabulary map in your speaker, and leave your ambitions at the station. We are not going out there to study it, she told them, and she meant what she said with the full weight of everything she had understood about the previous 3 weeks. We are going out there to be studied. We are going out there to try to earn the second conversation. The alien was there when they arrived at the perimeter. It was standing in the heather, in the dark and fog, with its joint glow steady and its head at that slight angle of assessment that Mira had long since begun to think of as its listening posture. It looked at Mira, then it looked at the 4 new people, then it looked back at Mira, and it made the sound, the concept, that she had mapped as again or once more or continuing. She said in its language, as precisely as she could manage, "Yes, more of us, here to listen." There was a long moment in which nothing happened except the fog moving through the heather and the very distant sound of the sea. Then the alien sat down, and Mira sat down, and the team from Edinburgh sat down, carefully, one by one, in the wet heather, at the edge of a bog on a Scottish moor, in the dark, at the beginning of something that none of them would live to see the end of, and all of them would spend the rest of their lives contributing to, because that is what humans do when they find the thing that matters. They sit down, and they stay, and they get to work.